As we prepare to take of the Lord's Supper this morning, we gather around this table, and I wonder if we see ourselves the way God sees us. A friend of mine came to church one Sunday, went to his church, saw that they were having communion that morning, and he immediately turned around and left. It wasn't that he didn't appreciate what these elements represent. It wasn't that he didn't realize how important it was to commemorate the sacrifice of Jesus. It wasn't that he didn't understand how communion had such a vital role in the life of the church. It's just that he felt unworthy. I wonder if we ever really see ourselves the way God sees us. And does communion, the act of communion, change that for us? Does it allow us to see ourselves differently because of what we celebrate here this morning? They say beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I wonder how God sees us. They say one man's trash is another man's treasure. Is that true? That seems especially true when it comes to modern art, doesn't it? You know what I mean. You go to a museum, a modern art museum, there's this giant, let's say a huge canvas there on the wall with one yellow dot in the middle. And then maybe like, let's say a purple square off to the side, and it's like $14,000. And you're like, I'm pretty sure I could do that. Pretty sure I could reproduce that. A while back, I came across this news story. A custodian in a modern art gallery in England was just doing his job. After hours, he came upon a bag of garbage and threw it away, innocent enough, except it turns out this transparent bag full of newspaper, cardboard, and other bits of paper was actually a very valuable piece of art on display. It was on loan from another museum. How does God see you? Is it possible that you sometimes undervalue what He cherishes? Is it possible you occasionally discount what He holds dear? Is there any chance that you see yourself as junk? Well, God sees you as art. If that's ever happened to you or to someone you love, then today's message is for you. Open with me, if you will, to 2 Samuel chapter 9, way back in the Old Testament, 2 Samuel chapter 9. Today, in this part of the Bible, fascinating chapter in the Old Testament, 2 Samuel 9, we will meet a guy named Mephibosheth. If I say that correctly all morning, I will be amazed. Mephibosheth. His name is difficult to remember, but his story is impossible to forget. 2 Samuel chapter 9. As we pick up the story, David is the famous individual in the Old Testament. David is at arguably the high point of his life. He has become the beloved king of Israel. Near the end of the previous chapter, we read these words. It says, David reigned over all of Israel, doing what was just and right for all his people. So this is arguably the high point of David's life. If you could track the trajectory of his life, it has been going up, and from this point on, shortly after this, it's going to start to go down. In other words, we are now at the pinnacle of his life after he had become king and before his infamous downfall and affair with Bathsheba. Now, David had always had God's heart. All of his life, in victory and in sin, he always had God's heart. That never left him, but perhaps it is never more evident than it will be in today's story. 2 Samuel chapter 9. It begins this way. The story says this. It says, David asked, is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake? Now, that's a loaded question. Don't skim right past it. Here's what you need to understand. Saul was the previous king of Israel, and he hated David. As in, he tried over and over again to kill David, which was complicated because Saul's son, Jonathan, was David's oldest and closest friend. And so this created tension. You can imagine. But more than that, Jonathan Saul's son, always believed that God had called David to be king, not his father. In fact, early on in their friendship together, Jonathan's father, Saul, was after David, and Jonathan actually helped David escape. But as he did, Jonathan said this to David. He said, "Do not ever cut off your kindness from my family. Do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." And David makes that promise. Even if I become king, he says, he would never cut off his kindness to Jonathan's family. Now, Saul and Jonathan eventually would die in battle, but David never forgot his promise. So here he is, king. His enemies are defeated. David remembers his promise. It comes to mind. How did he put it? Again, verse 1. David asks, "Is there anyone still left of the house of Saul to whom I can show kindness for Jonathan's sake?" In other words, I want to keep my promise. I told Jonathan I would. I will not forget what I promised Jonathan that I would do. So he calls for a guy that had worked for Saul who would maybe know this information. The answer to that, verse 2, says there was a servant of Saul's household named Ziba. They summoned him to appear before David, and the king said to him, "Are you Ziba?" "At your service," he replied. Verse 3, the king asked, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Kindness is really a theme of this entire chapter. But right away, here in verse 3, we realize it's not just kindness. Verse 3 says, the king asks, "Is there no one still alive from the house of Saul to whom I can show God's kindness?" Not just kindness in general, we're talking about God's kindness, kindness that is rooted in the Lord God of Israel, kindness that is modeled by God, that has been displayed by the way God chose his people, called them to himself, these unknown people that had nothing in themselves to make themselves worthy of that calling, but he called them to himself and brought them into this covenant relationship with him. Ephesians 5:1 tells us that we are to live a life of love, just as God loved us, that God is the model of the love that we are to show to others, and that was David's goal. I want to show kindness the way God has shown kindness to me and to our people. The actual word in the Hebrew is actually much deeper and richer than just kindness. It implies God's loving kindness and his grace, his covenant grace. So this is not just a tender sentiment. This is unconditional acceptance, undeserved, unearned, unrepayable, extravagant, lavish, costly grace. A kindness that is rooted in God's kindness. So, is there anyone left in Jonathan's family to whom David can show kindness? Well, David's about to find out. Second half of verse 3. Ziba answered the king, "There is still a son of Jonathan. He is lame in both feet. His name, we will later learn, is Mephibosheth." Imagine what it was like to be him. I mean, the story of Mephibosheth is a tragic story. He was crippled at age 5 when news reached their home that his father and grandfather had been killed. His nanny picked him up in a panic. As she ran, she tripped. The boy fell and his ankles were broken, the bones knit together poorly. So he grew up lame in both feet. And this physical disability would forever be linked to the time that he was left fatherless. His clumsy feet, a constant reminder of his painful childhood and economic ruin. I don't know what causes your limp this morning, spiritually, physically, emotionally. I don't know where you feel lame in spirit, in body, in the way you think about things. I do know this, that all of us are flawed individuals. It can happen when we're young. We can be victims of anger, abuse, divorce, violence, neglect. We are left with scars that handicap us physically, emotionally, and spiritually. We come to church every Sunday, and everyone seems all together, but deep down, each one of us has this sneaking suspicion that we don't belong. We know ourselves better than those around us know us, and we feel like we're not worthy to be at this table. It's interesting. Mephibosheth's name means seething dishonor. I can't imagine that any parent, certainly Jonathan, didn't give him that name. Must have been some kind of alteration of his name, some kind of nickname, some kind of change in his name that he had become known as seething dishonor, Mephibosheth. His disability back then would have been seen as a dishonor. And apparently, over time, he became angry, furious, outraged because of it. When life treats us unfairly, we get angry, and sometimes that anger can last a long time. So look at verse 4. Where is he, the king? That is, David asked. Where is this one that you tell me about? Ziba answered, he is at the house of Machir, son of Ammiel, in Lo-debar. So he lives in a town called Lo-debar. I'm interested in that name as well, the town that he lived in. Even in English, it kind of sounds bad. Lo-debar, like lower the bar a little bit. Lo-debar. And that's not far off, actually, because the word lo in Hebrew means no or not, no or not. I know this because when I studied in Israel back in seminary, we would travel around the land and we looked like tourists, average tourists, so the merchants would follow us on the streets and would chase us with souvenirs to buy, and we would say lo, 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 lo. It means no, not interested. So lo means no in Hebrew, but debar actually means pasture or pasture land. So Lo-debar means no pasture land. In other words, it was a desolate place, the middle of nowhere. Maybe even if you asked Mephibosheth, a God-forsaken place. So everything about Mephibosheth, his accent, his name, his hometown, reveals a man who felt physically, emotionally, and spiritually worthless. So what do you think is going on in his mind when there he is in this middle of nowhere place, and a group of individuals from the king show up at his door and says, the king would like to see you? That's exactly what happens. Verse 5, so King David had him brought from Lo-debar, from the house of Machir, son of Ammiel. Verse 6, when Mephibosheth, son of Jonathan, the son of Saul, came to David, he bowed down to pay him honor. David said, Mephibosheth. At your service, he replied. Now, David must have realized and picked up immediately from his body language and from his trembling that he was afraid, because notice what he says in verse 7. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore to you all the land that belonged to your grandfather Saul, and you will always eat at my table. Mephibosheth can't even process this. What is happening right now? He is still shaking when he responds in verse 8. Mephibosheth bowed down and said, what is your servant that you should notice a dead dog like me? Could it be that Mephibosheth is still a little unsure about the purpose of this visit? I mean, it was a custom back then in the lands around them, when a new king took over, all family members of the previous dynasty were executed to prevent any possibility of revolt. In other words, it was not uncommon for a new king back then to ask the question, is anyone left of the previous king's relatives? But the question was not to show kindness. The question was for brutal extermination. Mephibosheth could have thought that he was a dead duck, or how did he put it, a dead dog. And even in this episode, I'm reminded how easy it is for us to feel that we are unworthy when we come before God, especially when we come to communion. We don't belong. God is mad at me, maybe even out to get me. So easy for us to feel forgotten, scared, and scarred. So I love what David says. Again, verse 7. Don't be afraid, David said to him, for I will surely show you kindness, unconditional, loving kindness, covenantal kindness, for the sake of your father Jonathan. I will restore you all the land that belongs to you and your grandfather Saul. David restores the land belonging to his grandfather, the previous king of Israel. Mephibosheth will no longer be exiled to a wasteland. But then don't miss the end of verse 7. And you will always eat at my table. Eating at someone's table in biblical times was like a rare privilege. It was an intimate time of closeness with the family. It was much more than just simply fueling your body. It was a time of connecting around the table. It was a sign of deep fellowship and closeness. You will always eat at my table. What a story. What a transformation. Skip down now to the end of verse 11. It says, so Mephibosheth ate at David's table like one of the king's sons. That's incredible. I mean, think about what the dinners look like in that dining area. David's kids and family gathered around, distinguished guests and dignitaries who were visiting the king, honored friends, and Mephibosheth. And then look at the end of the chapter, the final verse, verse 13. And Mephibosheth lived in Jerusalem because he always ate at the king's table. And the Bible can't resist leaving this last phrase out. He was lame in both feet. Mephibosheth would remain disabled for the rest of his life. But his disability didn't keep him from eating at the king's table. It didn't matter, because the tablecloth of God's kindness covered his feet. And he was seen as one of the children. The king's kids. Maybe I've already made the connection to communion too obvious. Maybe I don't have to spell it out. I mean, the first two letters of Mephibosheth spell me. And when it comes to this king's table, we have so much in common with him. We come deeply aware of our own unworthiness. We come with scars and shortcomings and failures. We are those who are both sinners and sinned against as we come to this table. Nonetheless, the King has invited us. He has poured out his loving kindness upon us, his covenantal love. And when we come, the tablecloth of God's kindness covers our feet. And God offers you and me this promise: you will always eat at my table. Remember David's original question? It strikes me that he didn't ask, is there anyone left in Jonathan's household who is worthy? Is there anyone left that's good enough to sit at my table? David simply asked, is there anyone? Anyone within the reach of my promise? Communion isn't about something we deserve. It's not about something that we have made ourselves worthy enough to participate in. We come with all our baggage, with all our scars, with all our shortcomings, and then, like Mephibosheth, God begins the process of restoring us back to his original purpose for our life and the promises and the privileges that he wants us to experience. Perhaps I've made the connection to communion too obvious. But like Mephibosheth, we have been invited to also eat at his table. I'd like to invite the band and Pastor Kyle up at this time as we prepare to eat from the King's table where his grace covers our weakness.